The 5070 versus the 9070 is a very important comparison to make, but also a difficult one. Like, how do you factor in things like certain games just block out AMD from enabling path tracing, so you can't even see how it performs, so I can't put those on a bar graph? That's frustrating that some games do it, but they do. Now, the 5070 itself is kind of borderline on the usability of the performance here, but 50-ish FPS without frame gen using a reasonable amount of upscaling, make up your mind. But also, AMD's offering 16 gigabytes of VRAM, as opposed to 12, which we can see in this very same game gives the 9070 an outsized advantage when you're using settings that are able to be played even at native resolution with high ray tracing settings. But of course, what if you just enable upscaling and then that gets the VRAM under control? Or what if you turn down the graphics settings? And I'm going to try to address all of these complicated situations in today's video, focusing on the latest games of 2026. There's going to be so many bar graphs, including ray tracing and no ray tracing in case you want to separate those out. We're also going to have a look at performance per dollar. Where does that play out? And that means we have to look at current pricing because neither of these GPUs and neither really any other GPU for that matter selling for their MSRPs. While the 5070 launched at an MSRP of $550, the lowest price models are currently coming in at $625 and it goes up from there. This is in United States pricing. Other regions could be different. And the RX 9070s come in at $595 and up from there, and we're meant to have a $550 MSRP. So neither one's at the MSRP, but the NVIDIA GPU has gone higher above MSRP. In this video, I'm using the Acer Nitro for the RX 9070 from AMD, and for the NVIDIA 5070, I'm using the Founders Edition. Both of these were received as review samples when the cards originally launched. Now, with the new market pricing so crazy, if you're looking to upgrade, you should seriously consider the used market, and you should also consider selling your old hardware to fund your upgrade. Both of those things can be done at Jawa.gg, and a huge thank you to Jawa for sponsoring this part of today's video, and you can use code OWEN10 for $10 off your first purchase. Now, at Jawa, you can buy individual components, and again, the used market often has better pricing, significantly so than the new market. But also, you can get an entire pre-built system, and you can use their PC Finder to find the performance you want in specific games at specific resolutions. You can search for specific prices. You can even shop by theme to make sure it's going to match your room. And you can, like I said, also look for individual components. Funding your upgrade by selling your old hardware is also super simple, and there are two great options. One option, click the Get an Instant Offer button and sell directly to Jawa. You can do that with your GPU or your CPU and get an instant offer quickly by clicking that button. This is the maximum convenience route, but if you'd like to set your own price, you can create your own listings, become a Jawa verified seller. It could even be your own side business. There's tons of great reviews. Check out the sponsored link in the video description and or pinned comment. But let's get back to this actual head-to-head comparison. So how are we gonna do this? I could just jump into bar graphs, but I think we'll understand what's happening better if we start with side-by-side footage, and then we'll circle back around to those bar graphs at the end, because some of those bar graphs have weird numbers happening, and we'll understand them better if we look at this side-by-side footage. I'm gonna make myself tiny and out of the way, and away we go. So, let's start with the biggest release so far in 2026, and the testing in this video will be focused on newer games, what's going on in 2026 and the end of 2025. So Resident Evil Requiem is, as far as I can tell so far, the highest selling game in 2026, and it does feature a really nice path tracing mode that does add a lot visually to the game, and I hate this, but you're not even allowed to enable that setting on any hardware besides NVIDIA, and I don't know why. I don't know if this was some sponsorship deal behind the scenes, or if they just rely entirely on NVIDIA's ray reconstruction and were too lazy to try to implement other denoisers. Whatever the reason is, the 5070 can access this feature and AMD can't. And the frame rate is about 50 FPS in the most demanding scenes, which is usable, if not amazing, and that's DLSS balanced, but not using any frame generation. So it's something to weigh in. If you go to the next maxed out settings that both GPUs can actually handle, now the 9070 is ahead by 33% and is averaging 65 FPS versus only 49 on the 5070. Why is this happening? Let's pause for a second. It's a VRAM problem. Notice that the AMD GPU here is allocating 1300, or in other words, 13 gigabytes here of VRAM, and the NVIDIA GPU is trying to fill its full 12 gigabytes, but there's signs that it's running out because there's also a little bit of extra system RAM being used here compared to the AMD card, and we would not normally expect the 9070 to have a 33% performance advantage, but it is. So this is what can happen when you run out of VRAM. It spills into system memory, and this slows everything down. It can slow things down, it can cause missing textures, it can cause stutters, it sometimes crashes. The way it presents itself in every game can be different, but it is a real problem. And it's not just at 4K, we're seeing this at 1440p, and yeah, it's at completely maxed out settings other than path tracing, and it's at native resolution, which might not be the settings you would use, but they are usable settings. The 9070 is averaging over 60 FPS here, and I'm testing one of the more demanding areas of the game. Much of this game is in closed off areas in small hallways and rooms where the frame rates are actually much higher. So this is actually very usable as a choice, and so it's not an unrealistic setting where we're going over 12 gigabytes of VRAM, and the game does pop up a warning when you try to use these settings on the 5070. Now, that being said, you don't have to use these settings. That's why this comparison gets so complicated. Because if you use balanced upscaling, this supports DLSS and FSR4, then the 9070 drops to a 12% lead, which is much more typical of a result. And we can see that we are now staying right under that 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so the 5070 is okay. And so now we're seeing the actual raw power difference between the two cards. That being said, even with the ray tracing high enabled here, the 9070 is still winning by 12%. It's 106 FPS versus 95, and the FSR4 upscale does look pretty good here. Now, another option is just to turn graphic settings down, including turning ray tracing off. If you do that, just playing at the normal preset with RT off, this is now 129 FPS for the 9070 versus 109 FPS for the 5070. It's an 18% advantage for the 9070 for AMD here, and no upscaling required, right? So if you just choose to turn down the settings a bit, we get a lot more performance there. Now, another big release, also from Capcom, shows the same thing that we saw with RE Requiem. Pragmata offers path tracing, and it does make a big visual difference. There's tons of reflective surfaces, so it makes a big impact on the visuals for the game, and when you're in the more closed-in areas, the 5070 can average in the mid-60s, although in the more open areas, it does drop a bit, which we'll see here as I come out of this tunnel. And I can't put this on a bar graph because the AMD GPU just isn't offered this feature. I hate that they're not offered this feature. I want Capcom to offer this feature to AMD GPUs so we could at least see what the performance is like. We can see here in the more open environment, the NVIDIA GPU is dropping down to the low 50s or so. Still playable, and also a reasonable baseline for some frame generation. Again, this is not using frame gen for the performance numbers, since that shouldn't be really viewed as performance. But it's a somewhat usable option for the 5070. Now, at the maxed out settings that both GPUs can support, which does include some ray tracing just at a much lower quality, the 9070 is 19% ahead at 120 FPS versus 101 FPS. And the game still looks quite good, but the path tracing mode does look better, but it also runs a lot slower. So again, this is a really difficult comparison to make. This is at native resolution. You don't really need upscaling to get a high frame rate in this game unless you're using path tracing. That being said, I did test out using using DLSS and FSR4, which are both supported in this game, at the balanced setting, which is my, I feel like for 1440p, the most aggressive I'd like to go to see what we would do to our frame rates. It got the 9070 up to 153 FPS, and the 5070 is at 132, so that's a 16% advantage for the 9070, but I don't think the ray tracing looks very good when upscaled, so I wouldn't use upscaling in this game unless I was using the path tracing. Now, at the balanced preset, not upscaling, this is native resolution, it's just the preset name is balanced, and this also turns ray tracing off, so this is RT off at, you know, what you might think of as like a medium preset if this game named presets the way other games do. We're getting 138 FPS on the 9070 versus 118 on the 5070, so that is a 17% advantage for AMD here. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at if we did use upscaling. Now, when the RT is turned off, I actually think the upscaling looks more acceptable. It's just the ray tracing looks really bad upscaled in this game. So if we were using RT off on this balanced preset, then if we use balanced upscaling with DLSS and FSR4, which again are both supported here, we get AMD up to 176 FPS up against 146 on the 5070. That's a 21% performance advantage for the 9070. Now, because we're talking about path tracing, I'm going to throw in one test from an older game. I know this video is meant to focus on games from 2026 or the end of 2025, but I did want a game where you can actually test path tracing on both GPUs to measure the performance difference. And Cyberpunk does give us that option. That being said, the NVIDIA GPU has ray reconstruction available here, whereas AMD has FSR4 upscaling but no ray regeneration. So actually, when you look at the quality of the upscale and like the reflection in this puddle here, you'll notice it looks way better on the NVIDIA side. So also, the 5070 is 25% faster and does average 60 FPS with DLSS balanced on the 5070 here. And by using the upscaling, it mostly keeps you within the 12 gigabyte VRAM buffer as well. So the path tracing mode here is a usable choice for the 5070, and it's 25% faster, whereas the 9070 is hitting 48 FPS. It's a little more borderline, and without ray reconstruction, it doesn't have quite as good of image quality. Now, let's take a look at one of the newest releases of 2026, and I debated including this or not because the game is actually just in early access, it's not fully released, but considering the millions of sales and the hundreds of thousands of concurrent users on Steam, this is clearly a game that people are playing regardless of whether or not it, let me go back for a second actually because I didn't mention the performance stats, but I was too long-winded about why I included the game. But anyway, it's clearly a game people are playing, so I went ahead and tested it out. So Subnautica 2 at 1440p epic settings is the max settings. We're getting 42 FPS on the 9070 and 36 FPS on the 5070, which is a 17% advantage for the 9070, but I wouldn't use these settings. The epic settings in this game are ridiculously demanding, just don't use them. They're completely unoptimized. Now, if you use upscaling, it can help. Now, this is where I'm a little bit frustrated with this game. I know it's in early access, but there's no FSR support at all. So unless you're using like a mod like Optiscaler or something like that, you're stuck with using temporal super resolution for AMD, which I can match the internal rendering resolution of DLSS, but I would much rather have FSR4 than use TSR. Now, the 9070 is hitting 73 FPS, 5070 is hitting 65, and the TSR upscale does look okay. It's not a disaster or anything. It's just a feature support issue where NVIDIA does just have more feature support in games than AMD does, especially if you're looking at more niche things or early access titles and things like that. Now, if we drop to medium settings, which are much more optimized, the visuals still look pretty good, and we're now hitting 107 FPS versus 81, which gives the 9070 a 32% advantage. I did restart the game on both GPUs when applying the graphics settings, so I'm not quite sure why we're getting this big of a performance difference. There's not seemingly any VRAM issues or anything like that. It's just a huge performance advantage for AMD at the medium settings in this game. whatever, it's what we got. Now, if we kick on the balance level upscaling on the medium settings, now frame rates are great. We're at 158 FPS on the 9070 and 126 FPS on the 5070. So you can play this game at a high frame rate if you want. It's a 25% advantage for the 9070. So still a better than expected advantage, but it's just how it is in some games at certain settings, and that's what we're seeing here. There is the side-by-side footage, and you can take a look at if you feel like the graphic settings applied correctly and all that, but I did restart the game. Now, another huge release that just came out is Forza Horizon 6. At its maximum preset, including the maximum ray tracing preset, even with the maxed out ray tracing, the 9070 is 15% faster than the 5070 at 61 FPS versus 53. Both are playable, and they're also playable at native resolution here, even at the complete maxed out settings, including the maxed out ray tracing. So that's good. Now, that being said, you could use upscaling to significantly improve the performance on both GPUs. So the power lines there didn't look great upscaled, but other than that, most things looked pretty good with upscaling in this game. It also supports the latest upscalers for both, and it's 102 FPS versus 84, so AMD actually gains an advantage here to 21%. Gets a little bit more of a performance boost out of the upscale. It's possible that there's some VRAM concerns for the 5070 here, because we are on that kind of 12 to 13 gigabyte borderline there. So that's also, I'm wondering if that had anything to do with the 28% advantage here for the 9070, although with turning the RT off, which is what we're looking at here, it doesn't seem like we're over the VRAM limits. So it's a bit weird, but I am getting a 28% advantage here for the 9070. Could just be a game that is, just favoring the AMD GPU in this particular matchup. 123 FPS, giving it a pretty big advantage here. Now, if we use the upscaling on the extreme without RT preset, we're now getting 149 FPS on the 9070. Now, the 5070 is still completely doing a great job at 117 FPS, but it is a 27% advantage for the 9070. That is pretty noticeable. So really, both GPUs doing a great job in this game, but it is a pretty big lead for AMD. Even when that ray tracing was enabled, it had a noticeable lead, and with RT off, it's a very significant lead. Now, another huge release from 2026 is Crimson Desert. Now, at its maximum settings, which includes cinematic, and if you turn on ray reconstruction and or ray regeneration, it turns on an even higher ray tracing setting. And at native resolution, it's insanely demanding. It's 22 FPS versus 20. So yeah, the 9070 technically has a 10% advantage, but neither GPU is usable at these settings. So this isn't particularly meaningful. Now, if we kick on DLSS and FSR for balanced, it's still not how I'd want to play the game. This does more than double the frame rates, but we're only getting to 46 versus 44, AMD's lead dropping to 5%, 2 frames per second. Now, there's visual differences too, because ray regeneration and ray reconstruction have very different visual profiles. The AMD side looks a lot more pixelated, and the NVIDIA side looks a lot more smoothed. There's definitely differences in the image quality that you're getting out of those upscales, but neither one was particularly usable, so I wouldn't really worry too much about it on this particular game at those settings. Now, if we go down to the ultra settings, which by the way do still include ray tracing, this game just always has ray tracing turned on, or in its main presets anyway. So the ultra settings do include ray tracing at 75 FPS versus 73, 3% lead for the 9070. So this one's basically a tie, and both have a good performance without needing upscaling. That being said, if you do choose to use upscaling, we're now hitting 100 FPS on the 9070 and 90 FPS on the 5070. It's an 11% advantage for the 9070, and both GPUs are having a nice high frame rate experience. That being said, I don't like the look of the upscaling in this game. I think the grass looks pretty bad. I think the fire, when you see it, looks pretty bad upscaled. So personally, this is a game that I would play at native resolution without upscaling. I do think it looks noticeably better. Now, Call of Duty Black Ops 7 is another game where we can test out ray reconstruction versus ray regeneration, and it released towards the end of 2025, so I'm going to include it in this video. Now, here, the 9070 has an 83% advantage. So let's actually pause and talk. Why? Is this a mistake? 83%? What is happening? 84 FPS versus 46? Well, what's happening is VRAM problems, it seems, because the AMD GPU is having the system allocate almost 14 gigabytes of VRAM. The NVIDIA GPU can't do that, so it's probably relying more on system memory, although there's not huge differences in the allocated system RAM. The per process usage is actually about 2 gigabytes higher than the per process usage on the AMD side of things, indicating that this is most likely a VRAM-related problem. It's the only thing that seems to make sense to explain this large of a performance difference. Now, the AMD GPU is hitting 84 FPS as long as you're using FSR4 balanced, so this is usable, but I'm also noticing some other problems. I don't think the AMD GPU is properly rendering all of the ray traced reflections, and this was something I saw when I tested this game out when the ray regeneration first launched. So there's multiple places in the side-by-sides where I just don't think the ray traced reflections are properly rendering on the AMD side. So yes, there's a huge performance advantage here for the AMD GPU, but there also seems to be some visual issues. And realistically, this is a multiplayer game where these aren't the settings I would use anyway. So I also wouldn't get overly hung up on it. But I thought we should talk, since this is by far the biggest performance difference that we see between the two GPUs. And there's weird things happening. Anyway, again, look at the ocean water right now and the differences in the reflections. Anyway, if we drop down to the balanced settings, this is native resolution, but just the balanced preset. It's the name of the preset, and turn the ray tracing off and all that. This is more like how I think competitive players would play this game. 233 FPS versus 178. So the 9070 still has a 31% advantage, but AMD usually has an unusually high advantage in Call of Duty games. So this is expected behavior, whereas the 84%, like I said, was most likely due to a VRAM issue, but there were also some rendering issues. So anyway, if we kick on balanced upscaling on top of the balanced preset, now frame rates go up to 242 FPS versus 193, so a 25% lead for the 9070. It didn't gain a lot from the upscale, indicating we were probably at least at times hitting CPU-related limits, even though I'm on a 9800X 3D. So it didn't scale quite as much, just because we're starting to push into such high frame rates that you get some other system limitations affecting it. But it's still a 25% lead here. Now, Battlefield 6 also released towards the end of 2025, but if I'm including Call of Duty, I'm going to include this because I like it a lot better, honestly. Now, to get side-by-side footage in this one, since there's no built-in benchmark, I'm relying on the campaign, but the campaign still uses like the same graphical technology and stuff like that, so it should be pretty representative performance-wise. Now, the Overkill settings, which are the max settings at native 1440p, is a 9% advantage for the 9070 at 100 versus 92, which is very, very usable. That being said, if you do kick on balance level upscaling, which is what we're looking at next, the performance lead drops to 3% at 133 versus 129. So definitely not as much of an advantage for the 9070 in this game as we've seen in all of the other games. But it is still at least a small advantage, and both GPUs are getting really high performance, so it's not anything to be concerned about one way or the other. Now, if you drop down to the medium settings, which I think many people would do for a competitive multiplayer game, frame rates do jump up considerably. It's now 166 FPS versus 145 on the 5070, and it's increased to a 14% advantage for the AMD GPU, which is more in line with what we've seen as a more typical performance lead. So that's how it is in some games where certain graphics presets scale better for one brand or the other, and that's what we're seeing here. If we kick on balanced level upscaling on top of the medium graphics preset, performance goes way up. We're now up to 208 frames per second on the 9070, and 185 on the 5070. That's a 12% advantage for the 9070, which again is a fairly typical result from what we're seeing in most of these tests, and is a nice super high frame rate to enjoy the competitive gameplay here. In my opinion, if you're getting nearly 200 FPS and you don't get the kill, it's a skill issue, not a hardware issue. Anyway, so I did also want to test out one more competitive multiplayer game that had a built-in benchmark. So this is Marvel Rivals. This is again, an older game kind of released beginning of 2025. Might have actually been the very end of 2024. But anyway, it's kind of a 2025 game. So a bit older here, but it's 101 FPS versus 89 at the max ultra preset, 13% advantage for the 9070. This is also an Unreal Engine 5 game. Now, if we kick on balance level upscaling, I noticed that we didn't gain as much performance as I would have expected. It seemed a little bit weird, but hey, it is what it is. And we're at 110 FPS versus 108. So the 5070 seemed to scale, gain a bit more performance than the 9070 did by kicking on the upscale. Either way, you can play this game at the ultra preset with upscaling at over 100 FPS, which for many people, you're going to be perfectly happy with that level of performance. But if you're chasing for more and or you want to play at native resolution, you can switch to the medium preset, which is what we're looking at here. So if we drop down to the medium preset, we're now hitting 124 FPS on the 9070 at native resolution. And the 5070 at native 1440p medium settings, hitting 118 frames per second, so a 5% advantage for the 9070. So again, a game where we're not seeing as large of a performance lead for the 9070 compared to the 5070, down into the single digits here. And if we kick on the DLSS and FSR4 at the balance settings, actually, it's now basically a tie, but the 5070 does technically take the lead by 1 frame per second, which is less than 1% advantage, but did barely round up to 1% lead instead of a 0% lead. So there you go. It's now 170 and 171, so nice high frame rate experience. Most people are going to have good competitive experience here. Obviously, you could still turn down to even lower settings if you're like ultra competitive about it. And in the spirit of including a few games from last year to get to 10 big releases, because 2026 isn't even half over yet, so there weren't 10 big games for me to include here, I figured we might as well include the Game of the Year winner from 2025 from most media outlets. And at 1440p epic settings, we're at the max settings here, 56 FPS versus 48. It's 17% lead for the 9070. And I'd want a little bit of a higher frame rate even for this style of game. Kicking on balance level upscaling. And when the game launched, there was no FSR support, but the game has been patched and now have FSR4 support. So that's nice. But I'll mention it as just another one of those things where sometimes games launch without FSR support. That was annoying at launch, but it is there now. We're getting 91 FPS versus 78, which is again a 17% advantage for the 9070 over the 5070, staying consistent with the percentage advantage, but much higher frame rate. That would be a good way to play the game. If you prefer native resolution, the medium settings do also get a very similar frame rate to what we were seeing with upscaling on the max settings. We're at 96 FPS on the 9070 versus 82 on the 5070. Definitely a high enough frame rate to thoroughly enjoy this style of gameplay. And things still look pretty good at the medium settings. And we're getting a 17% advantage, so staying real consistent there with 17% lead for the 9070 in this game. Now, if we're on the medium preset, but also use the balance level upscaling, this is now getting us 137 FPS on the 9070 and 119 FPS on the 5070, has dropped to a 15% lead, but still pretty close to what we were seeing on the other settings we tested. And again, the FSR4 upscale looks pretty good here. Frame rates look pretty good overall. It was just annoying at launch to not have FSR4 support or any FSR support at all. But anyway, so let's go ahead and now switch to a bit of a summary of my overall thoughts on this comparison now that we've seen all of the details. So the average frame rate for both GPUs in all tests is displayed here. And if we look at this, how should we interpret this, right? So it's hard to get a lot out of this kind of a graph. There's just a lot going on, right? So, I mean, one thing you can look at is that, you know, there's the 50 FPS line right there, and the vast majority of everything was over that, and the only things that weren't were just like the super heavy, like max settings in UE5 games, or like path tracing, you know, and or the, you know, super heavy ray regeneration and ray reconstruction in Crimson Desert. So both are getting a good result, and you can see that usually red bar above green bar. So, you know, 9070 is generally ahead. But I often prefer to look at this style of graph for the comparison. So this is a percentage difference graph instead of a frame rate graph. So remember, in all of those side-by-sides, I was saying which GPU is faster by what percent. So this has all of those tests summarized here. Now, on this crazy high 83% advantage, that was that weird Call of Duty test where it was probably VRAM related, but there also seemed to be some graphical issues. But overall, the performance advantage I'm defining in terms of the 9070. And the geometric mean gives it a 16% advantage overall. The geo mean is more resistant to outliers, so this 83 isn't really doing much to that overall average since I'm using the geo mean. So geo mean of each GPU's overall frame rate average and then divide, and we get the 16% advantage for the 9070 is what we're looking at here. We can see that the 5070 only wins in path tracing, and then I guess technically had a 1% lead in Marvel Rivals at medium settings with balanced upscaling. So generally the 9070 is faster, and it on average is about 16% faster. I will note that when I originally reviewed these GPUs, I had it at 11% faster. Now this is a different set of games, so you would expect there to maybe be some differences, but I thought it's interesting that I'm now seeing the lead grow a bit for the 9070 a year later. But it's not the exact same suite of games tested, so I wouldn't necessarily say that's a sign of like aging with, fine wine, etc., that kind of thing. Now, I know some people are going to prefer to separate ray tracing from not ray tracing. Personally, I think that's a bit outdated. Like, I'm just testing out games at like their max preset and a notch down, and some games just always have ray tracing on now, although it's not a lot, and most games, though not all, are releasing with some sort of ray tracing support, and AMD's not even really that behind in ray tracing other than path tracing performance-wise. So to me, it's just another graphic setting that's near the top of the graphic settings list in a lot of games, so I don't see a big need to separate it out. That being said, if you do, here you go. So here's the average FPS of all the ray tracing enabled tests. If you want to look at the average FPS for each, kind of all summarized here. And you can see that the ray tracing is usable frame rates in the vast majority of situations where we're well above that kind of 50 FPS bar that you're seeing down at the bottom. And then if we want to look at it more as the percentage differential, here's what I mean about like, it's kind of pointless to sort of separate it out. If I look at just the ray tracing tests, the 9070 is averaging 15% faster instead of 16% faster. That's it. Again, by using the geomean, this 83 isn't having a huge impact on it. We have some other results that are also, in the teens. Like, we didn't see a huge difference between the ray tracing performance in most games when it was RT on and RT off. It's just like the AMD's 9000 series is caught up pretty well on normal ray tracing. It's just the path tracing where it's fallen behind. We can see that in Cyberpunk. And then remember, there were the games with path tracing modes that AMD just wasn't allowed to turn on by the game developers, which I think is dumb and annoying, but is still the case and a factor you could consider when buying the GPUs. Now, if we separate it out for no ray tracing, I don't want to see any ray tracing in my benchmarks. Okay, the 9070 averages 16% faster, so same result. Okay, there it is. Now, if you want to look at it as the average frame rate with no ray tracing enabled, here's what it looks like, okay? And you can compare those results. All right, so what's my overall thoughts? Well, there's one more thing that we could look at, which factors in the pricing, right? So this is, if you take the geometric mean of all of the FPS numbers we got for my 9070, it's 103. The geometric mean for all of the frame rate numbers we got for the 5070 and all of those benchmarks is 89. So if I take each GPU's average frame rate and divide it by its price, I'm just using the lowest price currently available new in the US market, so $625 for the 5070 and $595 for the 9070, then we're getting 0.17 for the 9070. Now, what does this mean? This is performance per dollar. It's the frames per dollar. So basically, you get 0.17 frames per dollar on the 9070, and you get 0.14 frames per dollar on the 5070. And then if I divide the frames per dollar by the frames per dollar here, we can get a value percentage advantage for the 9070. So if you want to try to summarize all of the numbers into a percentage value advantage, we get about 21.5%. So the 9070 offers 21.5% better value in terms of frames per dollar. That's one way, again, you can compare the GPUs. But like I said at the beginning, just looking at the frames per dollar kind of ignores things like the, what if you did want to play, Resident Evil Requiem at about 50 FPS, kick on some frame gen, and you want to enjoy the path trace, settings and something like that. That's not factored into this calculation, right? There's also, the games like Subnautica 2 that doesn't currently have FSR 4 support, which is annoying. Now you can mod it in with Upscale or something like that, but still, it's annoying, right? So there are things that don't show up in this kind of a stat. And that's why I thought it was important to look through all the side-by-sides and get a full idea of what it's like to actually use these GPUs. You'll notice all of my testing focused on 1440p in this video because I think that's going to be the most common target for these types of GPUs. Also, upscaling on a 1440p output would be similar numbers to what you'd get out of a 1080p native test, so it's kind of sort of taken care of there. And if you're like, what if I used 4K? Well, if you look at my 1440p results, it's kind of like what you'd get at DLSS quality or balanced on a 4K display. So I thought focusing on 1440p, but looking at more settings with more upscaling and different graphic settings tested would be better than just testing like native resolution max settings on different resolutions. So I thought this would be more helpful use of my testing time I had available. Anyway, so in the end though, you're gonna be looking at the GPU market, which one do you buy? And man, it's still not like a completely obvious call. I know some people are just screaming the 9070 is obviously better, and it's obviously faster in just about every situation. But okay, I am the kind of single player gamer that might play the path trace settings in Resident Evil Requiem. I'm that kind of guy. Also, like frame generation, I don't include it in these tests because it's not performance, but it is a nice to have feature. And NVIDIA does not only have better frame pacing, and the whole point of frame generation is motion smoothing. So frame pacing is pretty important. So NVIDIA's frame generation does have better frame pacing. It also has multi-frame generation support, now dynamic multi-frame generation support. So there are some arguments to be made in favor of the 5070. That being said, we also saw situations where having the additional VRAM absolutely mattered for the AMD GPU, right? These settings in Resident Evil Requiem are completely usable, and we're running over 12 gigabytes of VRAM, and it's causing problems. In the future, this is likely to become more common, not less common. So that's definitely something to consider. Also, image quality-wise, I do still think DLSS has a bit of an edge over FSR 4.1, but FSR 4.1 does look pretty good, and it's usable enough that it's really only in the detailed side-by-side. So it's not as big of an advantage as we used to see when it was like DLSS 3 versus FSR 2. It was just huge advantage NVIDIA. It's a much smaller advantage now. So it's something to consider. So honestly, I've got to say, I would probably lean 9070 here. It costs less. You get the 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and the performance advantage is pretty noticeable. When the performance per dollar advantage for AMD goes over 20%, I usually start to kind of lean in that direction since it starts to kind of make up for some of those feature differences. But also, though, in this case, you're also getting additional VRAM, which is kind of nice too. And like I said, FSR 4 is looking pretty good against DLSS now, and the ray tracing disadvantages are not too bad. Now, it's really just those path tracing modes. And the 5070 for path tracing is not amazing. It's borderline usable if you use enough upscaling, right? So I'm leaning 9070 here if you were asking me, but my goal here isn't to tell you which GPU to buy. It's to give you all of the information for you to decide what you're valuing more. Are you more in it for the raw performance and the additional VRAM? Or are you probably going to be playing, the path tracing modes with like, 50-ish FPS upscaled and then kick on some frame gen from there. If that calls to you more, or you just prefer the NVIDIA brand, look, I'm not going to tell you what to buy. I'm just telling you this is the comparison. You've got all the information you should need now to make your decision, but also seriously consider just checking out the used market. Like, I'm not even just saying this due to a sponsorship. Like, the new market on GPUs right now, not necessarily the best option. So you could check out java.gg in that sponsored link in the video description. And remember, you can use code OWEN10 for $10 off your first purchase. And even if you're buying the new GPUs, think about selling your old hardware to fund that upgrade with either the instant offer for maximum convenience or creating your own listings and setting your own prices. I hope all of you found the video useful and or interesting, and you have an excellent day.